Hello, everyone, and welcome to Legislature 201. Thank you for bearing with us with the delay from last week. I'm Niklas Kleinworth, a policy analyst here at the Idaho Freedom Foundation, and I'm joined here today by Fred Birnbaum, our Legislative Affairs Director and Budget Expert. Thanks for joining us, Fred.
Thank you, Niklas. You know what the term expert means? It means somebody who's 40 miles from home. So thanks, everyone, for joining us. You must really be interested in the budget to participate in a call at 7 p.m. And so we'll get started.
Yes. And so just a few housekeeping things before we go ahead and get started with the presentations. Just like in Legislature 101, we're going to save all the questions for the very end of the presentation, and all participants will be muted during the presentation. At the end, when you are asking your questions, make sure to use the raise hand feature to be recognized, and so the host can unmute you so you can ask your question. If you prefer not to ask your question verbally, it's okay to put your question in the chat at any point throughout the presentation, and we'll be sure to scan those at the very end and try to answer as many as we can. So take it away, Fred.
Great. So there should be a presentation coming up on the screen any minute, and we'll get started. So when you think of Idaho's budget, it is a process. A very detailed process, and it's probably the biggest process related to bills, which we'll explain, that exists in the legislature. So most of what we think of the legislature doing, it starts in January, right? Bills are introduced. Not so with the appropriations process, because the rest of the state, meaning the executive branch, the agencies, they work year-round. So once the session ends, they are actually working on the next year's budget. And they're working independently, but also with the governor's office getting guidance. So all of that is happening so that when the legislature shows up, the budget process is really already underway. And we'll kind of get into the specifics. So the agencies submit their requests to the governor, and those are actually online. The Division of Financial Management is supposed to publish them. They usually do. And these are very, very dense documents. They do have the top line spending information, but one agency can have several hundred pages of detail, and the detail can include justification for all kinds of things: staffing, vacancies, strategic plans. One of the things I'll note, we have a part-time legislature, and when they're off session, it's probably not the funnest thing to do for anyone, really, to go through hundreds and hundreds of pages of budget detail. But they are submitted and they are available in the fall. So the governor, his official recommendation, not the agencies, is presented really at the state of the state at a top line level. But there's a document which we'll talk about called the Legislative Budget Book. And that is actually published online, typically at the end of the day, after the governor delivers the state of the state. And it is just a starting point or a template. There's no buy-in automatically from the legislature. But the governor has a huge advantage because it's really a running start. So he and his agencies have worked in the off session. Legislature shows up in January. Some of the key members have seen highlights of the budget, but he's already got it laid out. So I just mentioned this earlier, the Legislative Budget Book. Those of you who have gone to the legislative website before may have found this. There is a way to click into budgets, and it's a little harder to find in the past, but it's there. And this is a book that's roughly 800 pages. It's not only a detailed description of the governor's budget recommendation, but they have a lot of history, background. They have definition of terms. And it is a starting point. The other good thing is that this book, if you went on now, today, you would see the 2024 budget book, but you could go back about 20 years, and you could see the evolution of the budget by agency over a couple decades. What is JFAC? The term is used a lot. It is the Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee. If you think of the U.S. Congress, you have a Senate, you have a House, and you may or may not read a lot about them trying to reconcile the budget between the House and the Senate. Well, in the Idaho legislature, it's a 3-month session generally. To be efficient, they've created a joint committee, 10 members from each body, and they jointly develop the budget. And the significant difference here is that when the budget leaves the committee, it doesn't go from one rotunda across the other. It does in the sense that it'll go to the floor of one then the other, but there's no additional committee process. A regular bill could start in a House committee, go to the House floor. If it passes, go to the Senate committee, go to the Senate floor. Since JFAC is joint, it leaves the committee, it goes to either floor and then across to the other. And that is where all appropriations bills originate, in this joint financial committee. So they have a tight schedule because there are over 100 budgets. And historically what they've done is they have a series of hearings of all the agency budgets. So they go through the state police, the community colleges, the K through 12, and they do all these hearings where they review budget presentations, and then they set the budgets. This session is going to be different, and I haven't seen this. This is my 10th session. And they're actually going to do the same process, but they're going to do it in micro cycles. So they'll do a few hearings, then set the budget on Fridays, then vote on those appropriations bills and start over. And part of the reason they're doing this is that all the budget bills historically came toward the end, most, not all, of the legislative session, and there really wasn't ample time to review them, at least in the minds of some legislators, because there were so many bills crammed in the final 2 or 3 weeks. So the schedule is changing, but the process is pretty much the same. So historically, JFAC would have these hearings, and they have staff who would sort of frame up, here's the budget request, and then the agency would, of course, ask for more money. I've only seen one agency ask for less. Maybe it's been more than one, but it's a very rare event. And it was almost like a filibuster. You know, they would do all these slides. Well, now the agencies are going to present their PowerPoint, and the staff will review that with JFAC, and they will show up for questions, not just to do a presentation. But one thing that hasn't changed, we don't have public testimony. And this is a very important function, JFAC, because the budget process is the required process the legislature has to do. And yet they have many committee hearings that they don't have to have necessarily on certain bills, and they allow testimony. And they claim that they don't have time for public testimony. And I think that is a problem, but it's not going to be resolved this year. So this might surprise some people, but after they do these presentations, so there's 20 people hearing the various agency presentations. Again, those are going to be shortened a little this year. What do they do? How do they develop the budget? So the 20 people subdivide into working groups. They're not public groups. And I think the reason they have historically gotten away with that is their work product is public. But these are sort of discussions like you'd have behind the scenes on a bill. And I guess I'm not going to comment on whether that should continue that way, but the point is these small work groups take the information and produce what we call budget motions. And a budget motion is basically the template. It's very number specific. So this is what the budget will be by line item rolled up, and they vote in JFAC, and if they approve the budget motion, that is then converted into a bill, and we'll talk more about that. So I sort of went into this. The budget setting is that process of taking the information presented during these hearings and other information in the budget book, and the construction of an actual budget motion. And the reason we talk about motions is often they're competing views of what the agency should get. Sometimes there's unanimity. Sometimes a more conservative group will say less money is needed than a more liberal group. One thing that is a little dismaying is you'd be amazed how many Democrats and Republicans are in complete agreement on these budgets. And you can look at their votes on every single budget motion. And there's a lot of unanimity. You'd think that the Democrats would vote no on a lot because they're too stingy, or the Republicans would vote no because they're too generous. You see a lot of unanimity. So the actual voting on motions is not dissimilar to voting on bills, which means a motion can be presented for, let's just say the budget is an overall 6% increase. Another member can say, I have a substitute motion. I only want to grow the budget for, and obviously the details provided. And then a third member can say, no, I think it should be flat. I'm only going with a 0.5 increase. And those can all be voted on in that reverse order or not. And of course, if they're voted down, the substitute motion, they go to the motion until one finally passes. All three can fail, and then they can do more motions. But ultimately, no budget is developed unless there's a budget motion vote preceding it. So there's some misinformation about how budgets operate as it relates to them going to the floor. So if a bill goes to the floor and the legislature feels it's too big, they can vote it down, but it doesn't defund an agency. We'll talk more about it. But the key point is when the budget comes to the floor, it's not amended on the floor. It's not that it's impossible, it's just not done. So if the members feel the budget is too big, they rarely feel that way, but some of them do, or I should say they don't do it often enough, they can just say, we're rejecting the budget. So the agency doesn't get zero. JFAC just develops and puts forth another budget. So it's a completely appropriate thing to reject a budget. So if it does fail, as I mentioned, it goes back, they revise the budget, they can make very minor changes, and then they send it back to the floor. Generally, they do listen to the members. If the members said, this one line item, we just don't support it, they're not going to just put it back exactly. Well, they can't make it exactly the same, but generally they will reflect the will of the body. Can an agency be defunded by a floor vote? Theoretically, yes. So in other words, because budgets are considered individually, it's not a unified budget like the U.S. House and Senate. It's possible, for example, if members just did not want to give any money, for example, to the Hispanic Commission or the Arts Commission, small bodies, they could just not fund it. But some of these agencies do exist in statute, so it's more likely that they would be cut or reduced greatly as opposed to completely zeroed out just on an appropriation. You'd probably need a policy bill to rescind the agency to really defund it. But nevertheless, if it passes and the governor signs it, that's the budget, it becomes law. Okay, I'm just pausing to catch my breath. We're going to talk a bit about how to read budgets. So Idaho has a fiscal year that runs mid-year to mid-year, starts July 1, ends June 30th. So fiscal year 24, I know it's a little confusing, started last July. And wait a minute, it's 23. And the reason for that, it sort of mimics the school year. So if you think about a school year, starts in the fall, obviously ends the following spring, summer. Our budget year runs in a similar fashion. Virtually every state does that. The federal government runs October 1 through September 30th. So sometimes you got some offsets. And then sometimes with tax legislation, it can be a problem because a tax year, we all know, is January through December. So if you're cutting taxes for a tax year, it's going to be half of one fiscal year or the other. That's just how it is. So the budget book, which I mentioned earlier, is a very thick volume. If you are really interested in learning about the budget process, you could do this, and you could actually open the document, it's a PDF, and start and just read all of it. And if you did that, you'd probably know more than a lot of legislators simply because they haven't devoted the time. Because the book provides an overview of the process. It shows you how it's structured. It has historical information, has a glossary. So it is the way you look at agencies in terms of how they spend money across time, and you can compare agencies to agencies. As I mentioned, you can look at agency detail, and that means things like staffing, spending growth, budget changes. And then they also in the budget book have 1 to 2 paragraphs providing justification for the requests. And this can be for supplementals, line items, or even just changes. So, for example, they might say, like they're going to do this year with Medicaid, they want to shift money to a hospital assessment, and they're going to explain that in the budget book. So this is this next page, and I hope everyone can see it on their computer. I have to put my readers on to see it. But this is a roll-up of the whole budget. And I guess there's a couple, we're not going to go into a ton of detail here, and of course, feel free to call me anytime. But when you think of the budget in Idaho, it is not, this is important, it's not zero-based. An agency doesn't say, well, using Medicaid, I've got 300,000 people who are going to be on Medicaid, and I need to spend X amount on pharmacy. I mean, they do look at this, and then I need exactly this amount for administration. I need this amount and they build it from zero. They do not do that in Idaho. The assumption is the prior year starting point. Prior year is the starting point. So you think, wow, if you always build on the prior year, how does the budget shrink? Well, the budget doesn't shrink. I was just looking at some numbers. So in the governor's first 4 years, so he came into office January of 2019. Of course, he was elected in November of 18. His first 4 years, the appropriations, this is all funds, are up over 50% from 2020 to 2024. And one of the reasons for that is the budget just builds on the prior year. And that's why when you see this decision unit, you see what's called the original appropriation. So you can look at the amount for the prior year, which we've highlighted in yellow, and that's the original appropriation. And then below that, you see things like reappropriation, supplementals, rescissions. Won't go into all of that. Just think of it this way. If you have a budget that splits the year, the legislature comes in mid-year. So they can tweak the existing year budget. And then, of course, you get a total appropriation. Why is all this important? These different line items, think of them as functioning as a bridge. And what you're doing is you're bridging year to year. And so you're bridging the last year's budget, which this year will be, of course, 24 to 25. On your screen, you're seeing 23 to 24. You're bridging that to what they call the base. And the base is basically the ongoing spending. And then they add to that things like the change in benefit costs for insurance, inflationary adjustments. CEC is change in employee compensation, e.g. the pay raise. And these are all considered necessary to maintain the current level of government. We think not all of these are necessary. For example, a pay raise is optional. It's not a necessity. I realize a lot of families need pay raises. But the point is the budget it's a process that sort of pyramids. And then between the maintenance and the total or original of the next year are all the new requests, the line items, which are now highlighted in yellow. So one of the challenges, we have a process that takes whatever we had before, doesn't examine the ongoing spending, except in rare occasions, and then says, gee, we need to replace things, and that could be ISP getting new patrol cars or bulletproof vests, or it could even just be new personal computers for the tax commission. So those are just the replacement items. And then they talk about changes in benefits. And then the line items by functional areas is new stuff. And so the process in a lot of ways is not geared to cutting as you can see, it's geared to adding. One last thing here, there's a column that says FTP, full-time positions. So if 2 people work in state government half-time, 0.5, 0.5, that's 1 FTP. So this is the full-time position equivalence. So it adds all the fractions and comes up with the round number. So if you see 20-some thousand full-time positions, that's exactly what it means. It means if you looked at all the people and you had people working full-time and some people working part-time, and you added all that up, that's the full-time equivalent. It does not include K through 12 teachers. They are district employees. So these are state employees. It does include university professors. It does not include school district employees, meaning teachers or anyone that works within the district. They are considered district employees. So it's a very sizable workforce. Okay, getting close to the end here, budget legislation. So all the things I showed you, legislatures can look at if they want. They don't have to outside of JFAC. But when they show up on the floor to vote for a budget, this is a document that they'll see. And one thing that will strike you is that, wow, it's just 1 page. And this is considered, the SOP, sort of the summary. And really what they're seeing is a very high-level version of the budget. What's changing? What are the major additions year over year? And this is what's caused a lot of consternation, because you're not really told anything by this document. You see line items, you see percentage changes. So a legislator either has to listen to the pitch from the member of the budget committee or go do their own work. Contrast that with a policy bill. The text of the bill is the change in the law. Yes, the numbers here are the change, but you don't really know a lot about them if you just look at this. There is a bill text that accompanies what we just showed as the SOP, but it's a very functional description, how the spending is broken down, federal funds, general funds, effective dates, some language. It doesn't tell you any of the whys. So between the bill text and the SOP, if it's a complex budget, you don't really know a lot about why it's going up, other than the person who's presenting, unless you're willing to invest the time going back to that budget book. Just want to throw this out there. This is a look back. So the fiscal report comes out after everyone has left, because once the budget is passed, it's then put into this fiscal report. It takes a few months. Usually comes out, I think, late summer-ish, fall. So it sounds a little confusing, but this past fall of 23, the fiscal 24 budget, which passed earlier in 23, the book is published for that, because again, fiscal 24 started July 1, 23. So it's a good way to look back at exactly what happened with the budget.
Okay. Well, thank you, Fred, for that presentation. And hopefully everybody walked away from that feeling like they understand the process for passing a budget better, and hopefully how to do their own homework too, as they want to try to understand what's going on in the budget. And that's part of IFF's job right now, is to try and demystify what's going on in the budget and help everybody understand what exactly our money is being spent on. And one of the ways that we do that is through the Idaho Spending Index, and you can probably see that coming up on the slides here pretty quickly. And the Idaho Spending Index, for those of you who have been through Legislature 101 and our 201 class now, you see that the process and for how we manage budget bills is very different than when we were managing policy bills. And so we had to when we originally developed the Freedom Index, we actually just excluded the budget bills because they just didn't apply to the metrics that we were using in the Freedom Index. And so in 2019, Fred had this great idea to develop the Spending Index, and back then it was kind of a shake and bake kind of analysis. We would holistically analyze the budget and decide whether or not it was a good budget or a bad budget, and we get a +1, -1, or a 0 based on that. And then this last legislative session, last year was the first year that we did this weighted system for the spending index. And Brian, can you just, where we did this weighted system for the spending index. And so that way we were able to start highlighting the serious issues in the budget, so specific things that were wrong with it, and it changed the spending index from just this is a bad budget kind of a index to something that becomes a tool for constituents and legislators to be able to figure out what's wrong with the budget and what can be changed to actually improve the budget and do better next time we get a budget bill through. And thanks to that, we were able to do things like cut a bunch of money that would have been wasted in Medicaid because there were ineligible people on the program that were being funded that wouldn't have been on there anymore. So it would just become a place to store money. And so this index has been very helpful for helping constituents save money. And so here's just kind of an overview of the metrics. I won't go through all of them, but it gives you a rough idea of what we're looking at when we're doing our spending index. So, for example, we're looking at things like, do they violate the U.S. Constitution? So, for instance, if there's a budget bill that's funding all of the diversity, equity, and inclusion positions at colleges and universities and these DEI bureaus, these organizations are violating the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. And so that is a negative point against the colleges and universities bill. Another thing that you'll notice is the maintenance budget growing slower than inflation? Fred talked about the maintenance budget pretty thoroughly, and basically what we're trying to figure out is the maintenance of current operations, the ongoing spending year after year that keeps on building, that spending that's not just one time, because that gets removed when you calculate that maintenance budget. Is that growing faster than the rate of inflation? And you get negative points if that budget is growing significantly faster. One final thing I want to make sure to highlight is are we passing? Is the budget unusually dependent on federal funding to accomplish its goals? And we saw in the governor's State of the State address, he talks a lot about how we're independent of federal funding, which is not true. 40%, or $2 out of every $5 spent by the Idaho legislature actually comes from the federal government. And so what we're going to, and a lot of these agency budgets are 90% or more dependent on federal dollars to continue their operations. And this violates Idaho's sovereignty as in a federal system where the federal government is supposed to do their own thing and then we do our own thing. We're essentially funding de facto government agencies right here at home. And so that's what that metric is supposed to measure. And so the next question is, how are lawmakers performing on the spending index? And unfortunately, not very well. About half of the GOP scored worse than the top-ranked Democrat on the spending index. 9 of them voted for every single spending bill, which is a real problem because that means they're not really discerning or teasing out what's a good spending bill and what's a bad spending bill. They're just rubber stamping it and giving it their seal of approval and saying, yes, we can spend millions of taxpayer dollars and I don't really care where it goes. This is essentially what they're saying when they do that. 24 Republicans scored lower than all Democrats, which is really surprising, actually. And some would probably argue that this is actually because a lot of Democrats voted against bad budget bills that didn't spend enough. But if you actually dig into it, this is roughly 11 bills that we're talking about, and 9 of them were actually issues that bills where the Democrats took issue with the policy side of those bills. So, for instance, funding a conservative attorney general, or other situations where, like the Opportunity Scholarships program, where the Democrats just oppose the policy side of that. And then finally, you'll see that there's a lot of polarization in the spending index as well. So either a legislator is really good or really bad on the spending index. 85% of them either fall in the very top or the very bottom. And you see this really badly in the Senate. So about 11 lawmakers will score in the top 25, the top quartile on the spending index, and then the rest will actually score in the bottom quartile or near the bottom quartile of the spending index. And this is actually a sign of improvement, though, because it was just last election cycle that in the Senate there was one fiscally conservative senator, and that was Senator Christy Zito. And now we're up to 11. So that means that we're seeing that Idaho is taking notice, and that the legislature is becoming more fiscally conservative as we go. So now that kind of wraps up my presentation on the spending index. We're transitioning to the Idaho Freedom Index, but we have a special treat for you. Ron Nate, our new president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation, is making a cameo here in Legislature 201. So thank you for joining us, Ron, and please tell us about the spending index and why we should care.
Sure. Thanks, Niklas. Excellent presentation so far from our budget specialist, Fred Birnbaum, and also from Niklas on the spending index. Looking at those results from the spending index, I don't know if this jumped out at you, but it sure jumped out at me. Those 9 legislators, Republican legislators, who voted for every single budget bill. Niklas called it a rubber stamp, but what I call it is, when I was in the legislature, I had some legislators talk to me about the committee work. And one of their little sayings was, we should trust the work of the committee. In other words, if a bill gets to the House floor, the Senate floor, well, the committee approved it, therefore we should approve it. That's not being a good legislator. That's not reading the bills. That's just saying, I'm going to let the committee do my work, and I'm just going to support the work of the committee. And on spending bills, remember, these spending bills are your tax dollars. So it's not merely a rubber stamp, it's that they're going to approve every dollar that comes across their desk. You ought to know if that's one of your legislators. On beyond spending, though, there's a lot of policy that can affect you too. Property rights, whether or not businesses are regulated, all sorts of tax policy can affect you and your family directly. We have the Freedom Index, which we've been doing at the Idaho Freedom Foundation since, I think, 2012. It's been a good 14 years, or let me do the math on that. Okay, 11, 12 years doing the Freedom Index. And I'd ask you this, before I talk specifically about the Freedom Index, do you know who your representatives and senators are? Do you know if they call themselves conservatives or liberals or Republicans or Democrats? How do they brand themselves? And then how do you know if they are actually living up to that brand? The tool I'm showing you today is the Idaho Freedom Index, and this will tell you whether or not they live up to what they say to you when they're running for office. The Idaho Freedom Index rates legislation. It looks at the bills and compares it to a metric. And the metric is 12 different items that determine whether the bill is a freedom bill or a non-freedom bill. We have 12 metrics, and here in the index, if you're on the little thumbnail video, you can see. And by the way, this is all available on our website. Also, at the end of this presentation, you can get an email address for the Idaho Freedom Foundation and send us an email, and we'll send you a hard copy of this so that you can go through it and highlight it and then bring it to your legislator to see if they want to comment on it. But the Freedom Index includes metrics like, does it grow government or shrink government? Does it turn more private sector work over to the public sector, meaning the government's going to take over or not? Does it increase barriers to entry in the market? Does it increase government redistribution of wealth? Does it restrict public access to information? In other words, is the government getting more secretive? Are they being as transparent as they should be? Does it violate the Principle of equal protection. One of my favorites is principle number 11. Does it violate the letter or spirit of the U.S. or Idaho constitutions? We look at every bill that comes through, and we try and rate it compared to these metrics. Let me take that back. We don't try and do it. We actually do it. And so you'll see bills that are sometimes -7 or -8, meaning they're violating 7 or 8 of those principles or violating a principle multiple times. You'll see some bills that are positive. In other words, they protect your rights. Maybe they'll protect a parent's right to know how their kid's doing in school and what kind of curriculum they're being taught. That's a government transparency bill, and that would get a plus. So the bills are rated plus or minus based on how well they do on these metrics. Then legislators earn a ranking based on how they vote on bills. I want to emphasize that because a lot of detractors of the Idaho Freedom Foundation say that the Freedom Foundation is there to beat up on legislators they don't like. Well, there's no legislator I don't like. But there are legislators who don't do well on the Freedom Index. I would love it if every legislator scored 100% on the Freedom Index, and I think Idaho would too, because your rights would be protected, your taxes would be low, your government would be limited. Unfortunately, legislators don't always vote according to freedom principles. Some of them claim to be conservatives, but yet vote a different way. And so if you look in the middle of the index, you can see all the legislators, every legislator, how their Freedom Index ranking is. And so if they scored above a 90, they'll get an A. If they scored above a 97, they'll get an A+. If they scored below a 60, they'll get an F. And so all the red ones are Fs, the green ones are A's and B's, and the yellow ones are C's and D's. And so you can see how they rank. And by the way, we also have an education index, and the spending index is included in here as well. As far as the results for this, if we go to the next slide, that this might be surprising to you. Idaho is often cast as the reddest of the red states, that we're the most conservative. We have 105 legislators. Only 24 of them are scoring in the A or B range on the Freedom Index. In other words, they're voting, the vast majority of legislators in the Idaho legislature are voting at a C or D or F range in terms of freedom principles. They're voting for bills that take away your rights, that shift more responsibility over to government and away from the family. They're voting for bills that violate the Constitution. 40 legislators voted for bigger government more than half the time. So that means they scored well below just the F range. They're in the F range for sure. Democrats reliably rank near the bottom, but we also have some Republicans ranking down there in the lower ranges of the Freedom Index as well. You might hear your legislator say, well, again, this is the Idaho Freedom Foundation. They just have their own biases. There are other institutions out there that rank legislators. The American Conservative Union, the Institution for Legislative Analysis, they all rank legislators too, and their results are very similar to the Idaho Freedom Foundation's. They don't have a beef against legislators. They just rank them based on conservative principles, how they vote on legislation matching those conservative principles, and they find, too, just like the Idaho Freedom Foundation does, that a lot of legislators don't vote as conservative as they say. 2024 is an election year. We try and provide as much information as we can so that you can make informed votes for your representatives and your senators. So I would encourage you, get a copy of the Freedom Index, get on our website, look at the Freedom Index, and see how that squares with what your representatives and senators are campaigning on. Also notice, if you're thinking about running for office, this is a great resource for figuring out how your current legislators are doing, and you can hold their feet to the fire and say, you know what, you say you're conservative, but here's your score. It's an excellent tool for candidates in an election process as well. I'd like again to thank Fred Birnbaum for giving us the excellent budget analysis and the process, and Los for hosting this and giving us great information about the spending index. And I'll turn the floor back over to Los.
Excellent. Thank you, Ron, for joining us. And it's really interesting to see just how far the Freedom Index has come over the years, because we get a lot of criticism, but for good reason, actually. go across the country and I meet other think tanks as well at various conferences, and people always come up to me and they're telling me how we have the most comprehensive bill rating index in the country. Nobody else is doing this, and this is a really valuable resource for lawmakers and constituents alike.
Absolutely. And I have people come up to me all the time and say how much they appreciate the Idaho Freedom Foundation for doing this work and this research and providing the information, because if you rely just on what candidates say or legislators say, you get a very distorted view. Sometimes the legislators themselves are surprised at what their score looks like because they think they're doing what they say they're doing, but the results don't match up. So it's a positive tool for Idaho, and I get a lot of good feedback in Idaho about what's going on with Freedom Foundation and the measures we're doing.
Exactly. So now is a good time for questions. If you guys have questions, it's okay to send those to info@idahofreedom.org if you come up with them later. But we'll address as many questions as we possibly can right now. We'll let Fred get back in his seat while we're doing that. But in the meantime, if you have a question, please be sure to raise your hand using the reactions feature on the Zoom platform. And if you prefer not to verbalize your question, it's okay to put that in the chat, and we'll read those off and try to answer as many of those as we can. Thank you, Fred. All right. So we're going to go through and see who has questions.
There is a question in the chat from Jeremy that says, thank you for this education. Just curious, when a preemptive state bill is passed, what does it do to local ordinances? Is the ordinance retroactively deactivated if it doesn't comply with the new law, or only parts that are specifically out of compliance with the new preemptive law?
So the way this sounds is if the city already has an ordinance in place, and then the legislature passes a law that supersedes that. And I can speak from experience with this particular thing, because the most recent bill that I can think of is when the legislature passed the No Funds for Abortion Act last year. And that specifically dealt with local units of government spending money that went to organizations that performed or supported abortions in the state of Idaho, and defunded those organizations. And so my understanding is it does depend quite a bit on how the bill is written. It has to be worded quite just right to be able to supersede those ordinances, but it can be done from the legislative level to supersede those ordinances. And now today we have a law that will defund local units of government for supporting abortion.
Right. And one area you've seen this in Idaho and maybe even other states is with the Second Amendment. So you've had liberal cities and more conservative states try to prohibit concealed carry permittees from actually exercising Second Amendment rights. And then you get a state preemption, which basically says that cities cannot impose additional restrictions. So that's where you see that. So yes, states can do it. Cities are not. I mean, they're local units of government. Some people think, we should let them do what they want. But if you had a patchwork of gun laws, would that really be very workable? You go into one city, you could use your permit, not in another. Actually, there was an attempt in, I don't know if it was Blaine County or just Ketchum, to ban plastic bags. The legislature preempted that, meaning the grocery bags. So the legislature does it, and I think in conservative states, typically what you see is them trying to rein in liberal cities that are restricting people's rights.
Exactly. So basically, I guess the takeaway here is that you can't confuse local units of government with the federalist principles of the state with the federal government.
Right.
States have a little more leeway than the
Right.
city would.
Yeah, and actually, counties and cities are a creation of the state.
Right.
But the states pre-existed the federal government, so it's a little different.
Exactly. Okay.
So another question from Tim Ward is, he says, we have to bend the knee to the feds because they are supporting 42% of our spending. What can we each do about this?
So I would say the best thing to do is to encourage your legislature to vote against policies that would continue to expand that federal control. You're exactly right. As the federal government has more and more control over our budget, they start to be able to pull the purse strings and decide how we spend that money. I wrote an article in my first summer here at the Idaho Freedom Foundation where Joe Biden had just issued an executive order that tied transgender bathroom policies to the National School Lunch Program. So basically, he was going to starve children unless the public schools complied with his radical agenda. And so it is a very serious issue. And I think a lot of lawmakers don't really realize that this federal money is not just free money. It had to come from somewhere. It had to be printed or it had to be borrowed. And that ends up getting paid by our children and grandchildren. And it is just very important that as constituents, we go to our lawmakers and we remind them that our children are paying for this, and we shouldn't be supporting budgets that are reliant on the federal spending.
I'd add one thing to that. There's some very specific budgets. So Medicaid is hugely funded by the federal government. Overall, it's roughly 70%. So legislators could repeal the expansion of Medicaid, which is about a $1.1 billion, and it's about $1 billion of which is federal money. So what the federal government does is it says, we're giving you this money, therefore you must do X, Y, and Z. So simply, you can go through, there's actually a federal funds report, and the state could either reject the money because they refuse to accept the grants, or the state could actually rescind programs that are not necessary and are heavily dependent on federal money. But I'll just say one other thing. When you hear the governor complain about the federal budget not being balanced and how Idaho is balancing its budget, Idaho is balancing its budget on the back of borrowed federal dollars. So we might brag about it, but when the federal budget was closer to being balanced, around 2001, Idaho only took about 30% of its overall appropriation from the feds, and now it's over 40. So when we take $1 billion plus less dollars from the feds, then I think we should hold the feds' feet to the fire to balance their budget. And if we took $1 billion less, and every state did, commensurate amount, we might be pretty close again to a balanced federal budget.
That's exactly right.
Okay, we have a question from Lyle J. He asks, what is the best method to draw attention to the budgeting process to possibly get citizens to care about growing government? Will we end up being Colorado or California?
I guess I'll start on that one. California is so insane. I don't think we'll get there. I think if we did, it would pretty much be all over. Colorado, it's possible. I struggle to answer this because I know, and the people on this call are interested in budgets and spending, but it's a pretty dry subject. It's not very sexy. So I think what you have to really speak to people about is, and I'll give you an example. Some of the conservatives voted against the state police budget, and the state police budget, I just looked, it's grown over 20% in the last few years. And these conservatives are being called, they're defund the police. Well, if you only favor a 15% increase over 3 years and not a 20, are you really defunding the police? And I bring this up because as much as a lot of people say they want to be fiscally conservative, what that really means is you have to spend less money. And if you say, well, everybody should spend less money except the police, or everyone should spend less money except K through 12, pretty soon it all adds up to spending more money. And so we have to, you can't say categorically, well, we can only cut spending from X. All of it has to be reviewed. So what I would encourage anyone who wants to make sure that this state doesn't have the budget explosion of a California, and I don't think Colorado actually has we're much better than Colorado. We're much better than California, but I don't think we're much better than Colorado because they have some restrictions. I think that's the mindset you have to adopt, which is just because you think you like an agency doesn't mean the agency should get a huge increase. Every budget should be scrutinized. The state police wanted a helicopter and pilots and mechanics, and they didn't ultimately get it. But if you're against that, are you against the state police? And that's how some opponents would paint the picture. But we have to scrutinize things, and that is all budgets. Because if we don't, if we accept A, B, and C, well, we like our new AG, he should get what he wants, but welfare shouldn't. Police should get what they want, but community colleges shouldn't, or K through 12 needs more money. But everybody's going to have a reason, and the mindset has to shift, which is this is a fact in Brad Little's term thus far. So he took office in January of 19, so he'd impact fiscal 20. Fiscal 20 to fiscal 24, the state appropriation, all funds, is up over 50%. And nobody knows that because he talks about these small numbers because they do some shell games. So everything has to be looked at.
And to build on that point, Fred, you said that everybody is going to have a reason. And the economist Ludwig von Mises once said in his book on bureaucracy, he said that there will always be a justification for how more money can help the program. And so but the problem with government is they don't really see money as a finite resource. They could always print more, or they can always just tax more. And so they don't usually make the budget calculus decisions that your average family over the kitchen table is going to have to make to figure out how to pay all the bills and get whatever they need to support the household. And so yes, more money could help in different ways. You could always make an argument for more money. But then what we do here at IFF is we also look at how more money hasn't helped. So, for instance, you look at the literacy rate in the public school system. We've dumped a ton of money into the public school system. We added more than $1 billion in the last 3 years. And the literacy rates, half of children can't read, and even a smaller percentage can't do math at grade level. And people would argue, oh, well, that's COVID. We were compensating for COVID, but these trends existed long before COVID. And the schools aren't broke. And so the argument that more money is going to fix the problem can be intriguing to legislators and to many constituents as well. But what we really need to do as people who are picking apart the fiscal conservatism issue, the issues with fiscal conservatism in the legislature, and showing that we're not as fiscally conservative as possible, illustrating to these people that more money is not always going to be the solution, is going to be the best way to do it.
Okay, we have 3 questions from Jefferson, but we might just have to get through them one at a time. The first one is corporate income tax collected in the general fund for the 2022-2023 fiscal year was $1 billion. Have you seen an analysis to see if the crony capitalist budget items such as the $130 million launch program, the grocery tax, etc., exceeded or were less than the $1 billion in taxes paid by the corporations?
So I haven't done an analysis of corporate income tax, and I don't have the figures off the top of my head. It's a very good question because things like the launch grant, and that's about $80 million, you have to go and actually look at all the tax exemptions. And there's a book, a general fund revenue book, and it lists all the sales and income, individual and corporate income tax exemptions. There's some very big ones related to investing in large facilities, and some of them include investing in data centers. And actually, those are very large. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars, and actually by far exceed the launch grant, which is just an expenditure. So it's very hard to see, though. It's a very good question, because what you're not seeing the unseen, meaning the money never came in, and you have to actually go and add all those back, which is different with the launch grant. We see that there's a line item for $75 million, and it's going to help the large businesses that need certain types of jobs, not all businesses. And you say, aha, but we haven't done a recent analysis of that. I can certainly point anyone to the data so you can look at that and add it up. I'll give you another example. Large hospitals like St. Luke's and St. Al's, they're considered nonprofit, so they pay no federal or state income tax. Their property taxes are exempt from tax, which is a shift to the rest of us. And then they don't pay sales tax when they buy medical equipment. So when they buy an MRI, they don't pay 6% on that. So yes, the crony system has absolutely led to carve-outs for a lot of businesses that are far bigger than the money spent on the launch grant.
Absolutely.
Jefferson's second question is, what is the IFF's position on the rights of corporations to have any say on how their $1 billion in taxes are spent?
Well, I mean, when you say how they're spent, everyone has a First Amendment right to their opinion. And this is part of the problem, I think, with modern politics, is that it isn't so much. So let's say you're a large corporation and you hire a lobbyist. Well, should you be prohibiting them? Well, maybe then they don't hire lobbyists, but they use the Chamber of Commerce or they use something. So, it's pretty hard to say that a corporation shouldn't have, a voice at the table, because, all right, if you limit companies, do you limit labor unions? I would say you'd have to. But here's the thing to also understand. When corporations hire lobbyists, they actually have to disclose that. But governments hire lobbyists, and governments lobby themselves. And we talked about the budget process. That whole presentation is they're basically lobbying for more money for their agency. So we actually have looked at that. And if you told the University of Idaho, for example, has a government relations person, well, they'll say that's not a lobbyist. It's somebody who just explains how the University of Idaho works, whatever. And if you said you can't hire lobbyists, they would just call the person a different name, or they'd say the person's assistant to the president. So then you basically are saying, well, then they shouldn't be able to show up. Well, who's they? Is it the CEO of the company? Is it an employee of the company? Is it a lawyer, a representative? So I don't think that's the way you're going to fix it. But what I do think, if you take a position which IFF has taken, which is tax cuts should be for everyone. In other words, if you're going to cut income tax, it should be across the board, not carve-outs. The way you end a lot of this is to get rid of the carve-outs. And the reason that would help is that a lot of corporations realize that a tax cut as big as they're getting for everybody probably wouldn't be affordable. Therefore, it wouldn't pass. So they would have to go for a smaller cut for everybody instead of a big cut for themselves. The reason carve-outs are so powerful is it can tremendously benefit a concentrated group of industries and not cost nearly as much as if you're giving a tax cut to 1 million people. And so I think that's why you really need, at the end of the day, you need good legislators. I mean, one of the reasons we did the Freedom Index, we negatively rate cronyistic carve-out bills. And you need legislators who are going to stand up to that. But to say that corporations shouldn't be allowed to lobby, it would just be very difficult to enforce because you'd basically would have to say they can't speak.
Okay, well, we're at 8 o'clock. Do you want to take one more question or?
I think we could take another.
We'll take one more.
Okay, the last question from Jefferson is, if the federal government were to collapse and all federal funding suddenly stopped, how would Idaho's government agencies respond to the lack of funds?
Well, that'll be a short answer. I mean, Medicaid would collapse, and you'd have a systemic collapse of the hospital system. I think we could operate our schools. You know, you would certainly see far fewer. There are a lot of teachers who are supported with federal dollars, professors, a lot of government workers. So, I mean, the federal government is not likely to collapse in the sense that it would pay, $0 to states. But if it had a structural realignment, it would have a very big ripple effect. And I think one of the areas you'd see it first is the medical system. So in Idaho, our big hospitals get more than half their revenue from Medicare and Medicaid. All the fancy buildings you see, St. Luke's, St. Al's, that's really supported by federal largesse. So I think the biggest hit would be to our medical system. And then, of course, you got federal land agencies, but I think we could manage the land better, so that wouldn't be a problem. So, yes, it would. I think where it would be most dramatic would be in the medical system, and then secondarily in the education system, which actually, in many ways, the education system would go back to before a lot of federal involvement, and it operated a heck of a lot better.
And to build on that, Fred, too, in analyzing all of those bills last year, what I saw is that the agencies that had the greatest share of federal dollars was actually all the different divisions within the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare. And so it's not necessarily just the medical system, but the health industry in its entirety. And it's because it's really subject to a lot of mission creep, I think. So you look at the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare, and they have programs where they're building trails now and funding transportation systems and doing all of these other things that really have nothing to do with healthcare or vital records or birth certificates or things that they are supposed to be dealing with as a state agency. And so and all of this is funded by federal money. It gets put up as a grant, and then the department absorbs it. They create a new program, and they tuck it in one of their bureaus, and it just takes off. And so I think you would see a sizable reduction in the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare. I agree with you that the education system would probably continue to operate, and we probably have a really hard time with these road projects and water projects that Governor Little has been touting in his budget. He says that we're not waiting for the federal government to come fix our infrastructure, but the problem is that he's spending federal dollars to do it. And so I think that Idaho would struggle substantially if we were to lose that 40% suddenly, but I also agree with you that it's rather unlikely. There would be structural cuts that would reduce it, and they would start with the healthcare industry.
Well, that's all the time we have tonight. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you got a lot out of it. Feel free to contact any one of us for any follow-up questions.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Have a good night.